Those of you who bring a mindset, right, and understand how these disruptions, phase change disruptions are happening, are going to be best positioned not just to survive, but also to increase your organizational capabilities and bring society, leapfrog the West to what I call a new age of freedom. I want to talk about the next 20 years, but before I do that, I want to take you back a little bit to history. 1900 New York City, we used cars, we humans used horses as our main means of transportation for thousands of years. In a sea of horses, there is one car in this picture. 13 years later, in a sea of cars, there is one horse in that picture. That was the last major disruption in transportation, and it happened really quickly. And in my work in disruption, we have found tons of examples of what we call the X curve. Essentially, 10 to 15-year disruptions across sectors, across time. Corn, dye, coal, across the board, insulin, 10 to 15-year disruptions. It's not unusual. And it's usually the experts and the insiders and the mainstream analysts who dismiss disruption. Even former entrepreneurs who disrupted industries don't see the next disruption. So today I want to tell you about the great transformation of humanity. And this is a compendium of several of my books over the last 10 years, 15 years, and some analyses. And essentially the summary is that disruptions are happening in all levels, all around the world, all at once. The next 15, 20 years are going to be the most disruptive in history, bar none. And it's not just disruption. It's what I call phase change disruption. And I will tell you what that means. But first, how does disruption even work? Because it's an abused term, right? And I have dedicated the last 15 years or so to study change. How does change happen? When does small change happen? And when does big change happen? And this is the quick slide to understand. We start usually from a place of stability. And this can be at a societal level. It can usually be at an industry sector level, right? So in the case of electric power, for instance, the value chain, the transmission and distribution have more or less worked the same way for the last 100 years. Now, we've had innovations, but the value chain itself, more or less, has been stable. But all along, there are technologies that are improving in cost and capability. And we need to understand what to pay attention to, right? Because usually, yes, there are disruptive technologies, but the big disruptions, the 10x disruptions, what I call phase change disruptions, happen when there is a convergence of technologies. Now, when there is a convergence, it opens up the opportunity space. Entrepreneurs see it. Now, think about Tesla and BYD and others around 2009, right? That's when the convergence for electric vehicles happened. So a bunch of entrepreneurs rush into this place, and over the following few years, they invest and they improve their products in cost and capability, right? So whether it's solar or electric vehicles and whatnot, over the following few years, they improve until they rupture the system. So the system, the rupture point for electric vehicles happened around about 2020. And essentially after that, we enter into a phase change. The system becomes unstable. So the things that used to hold the system together don't work anymore. The rules, the old rules don't apply. The new rules may not be clear, but the old rules certainly don't apply anymore. So in that phase change, essentially, after that instability, because the old rules, the old brakes don't work, that's why the new disruption always happens as S-curves. And then the new becomes the new system, and we go back and we start over again. So let me tell you about several of these topics. Technology cost curves. So in my book, Clean Disruption of 2014, I basically published this exact slide where I said, over the following 15 years, here's the cost curve of lithium-ion batteries. And, you know, at the time, I mean, folks called me insane. You, Tony Seba, are insane, right? $100 per kilowatt hour by 2023? Really? Well, here we are. And it just crossed $100 per kilowatt hour, just on the money. But the point is not to be right on the money to the month. The point is more or less to anticipate the disruption. I mean, it doesn't take a genius, because cost curves are like gravity. They're like gravity. It will happen. Now, convergence is what opens up the phase change, the big disruptions, right? So think about 2007. Why did both Apple and Google come up with the iPhone and iOS the same year? I mean, Android and iOS the same year, 2007. Not 2004, not 2010. Why 2007? That's because all the technologies that were essential to making a $600 smartphone converged in 2007. So the disruption was going to happen, right? And the other lesson is the following. Disruptions come from the edge. The incumbents didn't see it coming. Motorola didn't see it. Remember them? Nokia didn't see it. Remember them? Right? So it was two companies that never built a phone before that came into the space and disrupted the incumbents. And so right now, I mean, I have followed these technologies for a good 10 or 15 years, and they're key to many of the disruptions that are happening today because they've been teeing up over the last 10 or 15 years. And this is not all, but this is just an example of key technologies that I follow in my work every day. S-curve is very important, right? I mean, you sometimes see straight line predictions for technology. That never happens, not a single time in history. Has there been a disruption that happens linearly, right? And I've studied disruptions all the way back to, well, the first domestication of plants and animals, which was a major disruption. But going back to the car in America, from about 1910 to 1920, so in the space of 10 years, essentially it went from about 10 to about 80% penetration in just 10 years. And that was more than 100 years ago. And it happened while we built two new industries, right? We built a new road transportation. We fought a war and the meanest influenza pandemic in history. Does that sound familiar, right? So if anything, S-curves are accelerating. Some of these S-curves look like J-curves. It happens so quickly. But it's always as an S-curve, right? So here's a question that I ask myself in my work. Why do smart people in smart companies, even former winning disruptive entrepreneurs, don't see the next disruption? Why do they not see the disruption that entrepreneurs do? That's because of the incumbent mindset, right? There's a whole number of attributes within the incumbent mindset, but one of them is the linearity in which they see the world changing, right? That the EV is just a clean combustion engine. It's not. It's something totally different. right? And the one-to-one substitution, the idea that I call the faster horse syndrome, right? The faster horse syndrome essentially is the idea that, 100 years ago, the car was just a faster horse because, that was what we knew. But of course we know that the car was not just a faster horse, right? The car enabled the biggest disruption at all levels, right? Sector in transportation, in energy, at the societal level, right? Everything changed in the 20th century because of the car and electricity, right? And so the key idea of a phase change disruption is that it leads to a new system. It's not just a variant of the old system, it's a dramatically new system with new rules and new metrics and new behaviors that you may not even think about in the past. It's not a one-to-one substitution. So a key idea to think about this is that a butterfly is not a faster caterpillar, right? A butterfly is something else altogether. It's a different life form. So when you think about these phase change disruptions, think about a different life form altogether. And the ripple effects across society of phase change disruptions can be amazing, right? So again, the car changed everything about the 20th century. It changed geopolitics, it changed war, it changed how we built cities. We built cities for the car in the 20th century, not for people, right? So it changed everything. So let me talk about the first phase change disruption of tonight, the disruption of transportation. And that's my lovely wife, by the way, in that picture in California. So again, in that same book, Clean Disruption, I published this other cost curve for electric vehicles with 200 mile, 300 plus kilometer range. And again, at the time, there was only Tesla, the Model S, which was $80,000 or $100,000, right? And the idea, I said that by 2023, by now, there would be $15,000 electric vehicles with 300 kilometer range, no subsidy, right? The market would bring them. And that was considered insane at the time. And I also said that by 2025, it would get down to about 11,500. Inconceivable, right? Again, it sounded insane. And, I went to the Shanghai Auto Show in April. The BYD Seagull is $11,400, right? Not bad, eh? Right? Again, cost curves are like gravity. There's no opinions about gravity, right? So BYD was even a couple years ahead of what was insane prediction of 10 years ago, right? And if you look at the Chinese auto market, the largest in the world, September, new energy vehicles, which is electric plus plug-in hybrids, were 39% of new vehicles, up from like 2% 5 years ago, right? So it's happening very quickly. And some folks, even in the industry, are saying that it might be 80% by 2025, not just 2030. Again, my crazy prediction from 2014 was that by 2030 it's over, right? And so why? Because by 2030, there's going to be $5,000. So that car is probably going to cost $5,000. So for purely economic reasons, by 2030, transportation in competitive markets, it's pretty much over for combustion engines. But that is not the disruption, really. The big phase change disruption is actually the convergence of autonomous, electric, and on-demand transportation. Think Uber, Didi, robotaxi, right? Owned, managed by fleets. So essentially, you know that there are already autonomous vehicles level 4, pretty much in many countries by now. In China, I saw them, and in San Francisco. I mean, this is a ride. They're commercial. 2 companies already are offering commercial rides in San Francisco. And we know that AI is improving at crazy, not just exponential, double exponential basis. I mean, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, says that it's improving at the rate of about 1 million times over the next 10 years, right? So the idea that level 4 is not going to improve and be many, many times better than human drivers is not looking at the evidence, right? And so the day that transport as a service, right, is available, it's going to be on a per kilometer basis, 1/10 of the cost of owning a car, any car, 1/10. 10x has always enabled disruptions and quick disruptions, always, every single time in history. TaaS is going to be so cheap, it's going to be 4 times cheaper than the operating cost of a combustion engine car. 4 times cheaper than just the operating costs, right? It's going to be so cheap that the cost per kilometer is going to be cheaper than just the cost of gasoline. What do you think is going to happen, right? So I see that by 2030, most miles will be electric in one form or another. So let me talk about disruption of energy. So that was transportation, phase change disruption. Energy is a little bit different, but technology cost curve, we start with solar. Solar today is the cheapest source of energy on the planet in history. There never has been a source of energy as cheap, period, right? It's so cheap that solar plus a few hours of storage, what's called nearly firm, is cheaper than the operating cost of pretty much everything else. The operating cost, right? So it's over, right? And why? Well, solar PV went down by 82% in the 2010s, from 2010 to about 2020. And some folks in the media said, this is shocking. Nobody could have predicted that, right? No, I did, right? I predicted it. I said PV was going to drop by 80 to 90% in the 2010s. Boom, right? Cost curves, gravity. So it happened as predicted. And today in many countries, including the US, in the US, 92% of projects waiting to be interconnected to the grid are solar or wind. And 99% of storage is batteries, right? Here's the convergence. It's happening for economic reasons, right? And so consumers like steel are following solar energy because it's cheap, right? A lot of industries just need cheap energy. And solar PV is going to keep dropping by another 70%. And batteries, which dropped by about 87%, which, by the way, shocking, right? Nobody could have predicted. Well, actually, no. It's going to increase by another 80%, right? So when the cheapest source of energy gets 70% cheaper, what do you think is going to happen? Disruption, right? But, and here's the but, it's not just a one-to-one substitution of the existing system, right? It's going to be a dramatically different system. How so? So when I asked my team, let's design a 100% solar, wind, and battery system for every place on Earth. Is that possible? And if so, how much is it going to be? So we looked at how to design the new system, and we came up with essentially a transformation. It's not going to be a one-to-one substitution where you swap out coal or gas or whatever, and you put in solar and batteries. That's not the way it's going to happen. Essentially, if we design the new system for the trough, so today we design electric power for the peak. If you design it for the trough, meaning the darkest week of the year, when you get the least sunshine and the least wind, if you design it for that week, then what is going to happen is that you're going to generate so much more energy the rest of the year, right? And if you design it that way, essentially, you can power pretty much every place on Earth. Alaska can be powered. Germany can be powered. Denmark, with a 100% solar, wind, and battery system. I went to Kotzebue, Alaska, 50 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle to do the numbers. And it works, right? Again, here's my lovely wife who comes with me to many of these trips. And so in Alaska it works, and it's the cheapest possible energy system. In Germany it works, and it's the cheapest possible energy system. And you don't need seasonal storage. You don't need hydrogen. You only need 1, 2, 3, 5 days of battery storage. And it's a phase change transformation into a new system. And essentially, it's non-linear. So why does it work? Well, what we found when we studied this was a new property which we call the clean energy U-curve, which says you can essentially trade off storage and generation. So the more generation you have, the less storage you need. It's not intuitive, but we found that. But it's along a U-curve, right? So if you design the system for the bottom of the U, derivative is equal to 0, then you get massive amounts of power, 2, 3, 4, 5 times more power the rest of the year, which we call superpower. And superpower is an emergent property of the new system, right? So imagine a system that generates 5 times more energy than the existing system most of the year, right? Nothing can compete with that. So a place like Texas can essentially have 100% SWB with two days of storage. And disruptive economics, because it's non-linear, you can add 20% to the system in terms of money, and it returns 200% more energy. Pretty cool, right? For the financial folks in the room, 20% increase in investment, 200% increase in energy return. So, this is not just an energy transition. This is a real phase change disruption of solar, wind, and battery. Now, let me quickly talk about food, because it's really important, and it could be really beneficial for Saudi Arabia, actually. And so I start with insulin, which of course is medicine, not food, but 40 years ago, in the 1970s, insulin was made from animals. So you needed about 50,000 animals to produce 1 kilo of insulin. Not cheap, right? And in the early 1980s, about 40 years ago, a company called Genentech invented a new process, which I now call precision fermentation. If you modify genetically a yeast, it can produce any protein or any organic molecule that you want. And so that's what they did. And of course, at the time, it was very expensive. And human insulin disrupted animal insulin within 13 years, even though it's healthcare, right? So that technology is called precision fermentation. And it's a little upgrade from fermenting beer. Only, the yeast or bacterium is genetically modified to produce, via fermentation, almost anything you want. So let me talk quickly about the disruption of the cow, and specifically about the disruption of milk. Why milk? Because milk is 3% protein. The thing that makes milk milk are 2 proteins called casein and whey. But that's only 3% of dairy, right? And so this is a business-to-business ingredient disruption. Make casein for this industry. So if all precision fermentation does is disrupt protein bars and protein shakes, then the whole dairy industry collapses. And PF dairy proteins are here now. You can eat, I mean, I already eat chocolate and so on with precision fermentation proteins. The chemistry is exactly the same. It's just two different ways to produce it. Now, there are dozens of PF molecules out there over the last 40 years. Now, why do we want to think about this now? Because of the cost curve, right? So again, cost curves are like gravity, and this makes actually Moore's law look linear. I mean, the cost of PF went from $1 million a kilo to about $100 in 20 years. From $1 million to 100. If it keeps going that way, it's going to be about $1 per kilo, maybe $2 by 2030. And why is that interesting? Because animal proteins sell for about $10 in wholesale markets. So casein and whey and so on, $10. If my numbers are right, the industry is going to reach that in 2025. Only 2 years away, actually a year and a half from now, right? So that's when the collapse of the dairy industry starts. And it's going to happen for economic reasons. And we know that food ingredient disruptions follow S-curves, and they can happen very quickly. Pepsi and Coke in the US in the 1980s went from 0 corn sugar to 100% corn sugar in 4 years, right? That's how quickly things are going to happen. And this is not a veggie revolution. This is literally the second domestication of plants and animals. We're making with microorganisms what we used to make with macroorganisms. And PF is so much more efficient than livestock, than animals. Just land use is 100 times more resource efficient. 100 times, right? You need 1% of the land for PF to produce the same amount that the cow produces, 1%. And that is really important. PF can be made anywhere. Water, energy, and a little bit of sugar. That's all you need to feed a whole country, right? And again, it's not a one-to-one substitution. There are molecules called sweet proteins that are on a weight basis 1,000 times sweeter than cane sugar. 1,000 times. So 1 kilo of sweet protein essentially substitutes for 1 ton of sugar. Boom, right? I mean, it's over for corn sugar, cane sugar, and so on and so forth. So, if I'm right, fermentation farms, precision fermentation farms are essentially the new food farms. So let me put this together. As you can see, phase change disruptions are happening in every sector, everywhere, all at once. And when that happens, the ripple effects to humanity are going to be huge. In my estimation, we haven't seen transformation of humanity this big since the first domestication of plants and animals 10,000 years ago. And the system that Europe and America built over the last couple hundred years is already ruptured, and we're going into disequilibrium worldwide because these 5 foundational sectors, food, energy, transport, information, technology, and materials, are all being disrupted at the same time. It's happening in the 2020s and 30s, and it's happening for economic reasons. So the system, meaning the world system order that we call, is going to enter a big disequilibrium. The good news is that we're going to have a construction boom. So as the old collapses, we're going to build 3 whole new industries over the next 15 or 20 years. So some of the implications, land use, sounds really, really insane, right? Did I say that some people say that I'm insane and then 10 years later it happens? If I'm right, We are about precision fermentation. We're going to get back 2.7 billion hectares of land that is now used by livestock agriculture. That's the size of the US, China, and Australia combined. We're going to get that back. And that has huge implications geopolitically, but also for climate, right? If all we do as a society is invest in these 3 disruptions that I talked about, we can decarbonize 90% of the economy for economic reasons by 2035. And we actually go into zero by 2040 and net negative. Now, why net negative? Because we're going to get so much land back. And if all we do is leave it alone, it can actually absorb about 20% of the CO2 equivalent that we emit today, right? And here's the key. Everything we know about economics is about to change. Because if you follow the cost curves for energy and also the phase change disruptions, transportation and food, it's all going to superabundance and near zero cost. I mean, if you've looked at ChatGPT, you know where AI is going. Essentially, superabundant intelligence, and the cost of intelligence is going to zero. And the same thing is going to happen with labor. Are we ready for a world in which intelligence, labor, energy, transport, and food are actually asymptotically getting to zero? Because those of you who get that, right, and plan over the next 15, 20 years, will actually be the ones to win in the great transformation of humanity. Those of you who bring a mindset, right, and understand how these disruptions, phase change disruptions are happening, are going to be best positioned, not just to survive, but also to increase your organizational capabilities and bring society, leapfrog the West to what I call a new age of freedom. So this is not just a transition of any of these things. Transition implies an orderly change. This is humanity's great transformation. Thank you. Thank you.